My name is Christian, and yeah, I'm a co-founder and CEO of Container xChange. As you might have heard just now, there was an announcement that this session will be recorded and will also be provided on demand for those of you who could not join and who might have registered but could not join this live session. So just be aware. There's a little bit of a disclaimer. Of course, there will also be our report and some content from the session distributed via email after the session. So make sure to keep a lookout onto your inbox. While we wait a couple more minutes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes for everyone to join, feel free to say hi in the chat here in the chat on the right hand side, I guess, and mention the company that you're from, just so that we're aware who's there, and also put some of your questions maybe a little bit more into context. Yeah, and like you see here on the slide, feel also free to just post any question that you have into the chat, and then we're going to answer them at the end of the session. We have reserved about 20 minutes for an open Q&A discussion, so that we have ample time to address and answer as many questions as possible from you. Cool. Maybe then a little bit more context to kick things off. What's this webinar all about? Yes, it's about demurrage and detention. So we'll provide a little bit of context and current politics around demurrage and detention. What's happening at the FMC? Why is there so much focus on these charges? What's expected to be happening in the future? Then we're going to take some excerpts or some insights from our Demurrage and Detention benchmark report. We do that every year, that we look at the data and do a benchmarking across carriers and across ports to find out what are the trends and what are the developments. And then, of course, like I said, at the end, we've reserved 20 minutes for an open Q&A from all of you to engage with all of us. So with Eric, Chantal, and myself. Perfect. So I guess that's enough in terms of waiting. Maybe let's kick this off with you, Eric. And in terms of context, can you give us especially for the people joining who are not such experts in demurrage and detention, can you give us a brief rundown of demurrage and detention over the past few years? What are they and what's happening?
Sure. First of all, thanks, Christian and your team for inviting me. Always enjoy doing events and webcasts with you and your team. So just real quick, like in terms of a level set definition wise, demurrage would be container storage inside of a container terminal that is assessed to some party, generally the BCO or shipper whose cargo is inside the container. Often there are parties that pay that storage fee on the shipper's behalf, and then have to claw that penalty or fee back for to sort of make themselves whole. And we'll get into some of the permutations of how that's all billed later, because that's sort of at the heart of what's going on, especially in North America right now. Detention would be once the container leaves the container terminal and is sort of out in the wild. There's a certain number of days that are contractually written into a contract that the party receiving the container can hold on to it before they need to return it back to the terminal. And if they exceed that, then it's called detention, and you similarly are charged fees. I think from a process perspective, one key thing to understand is demurrage is generally paid at the time that the container is released from the terminal. So terminals will generally not release a container until those fees have been cleared. Detention is generally charged after the fact. So there's some billing kind of differences between those two things. They are often connected together, I think, simply because they both start with D and they're both sort of related to fees for holding on or for exceeding a contractually determined number of days that a box can be in a particular place. But they're very different processes, and they're assessed by different parties as well. I think one other thing I'll add, because you sort of asked about looking back on this over the last few years. I know we're all tired about talking about what changed during the pandemic, but from my perspective, talking to BCOs quite a bit on a regular basis, I think the thing that fundamentally changes, it's not that these costs didn't exist, and it's not that these costs didn't get sometimes exorbitant for them, but the scale of which they increased during the pandemic due to port congestion, due to an inability to return containers in some cases, in terms of a choice that a shipper might make to actually store a container on a terminal and incur demurrage fees in lieu of, moving it to or not being able to get it out of a facility. Those things just skyrocketed, right? All the little kind of inefficiencies in the system really got exposed to a huge degree during the pandemic. So it went from what I see as sort of an annoyance for shippers to something that they needed to strategically address. And I have one conversation with a shipper that we know well, a big US importer, who said these fees were into the seven figures for them in 21 or 22, I forget which year he was referring to. But so this has become a huge line item for shippers to deal with. It's not just sort of a cost of doing business on a low container rate. It's a huge excess cost, unbudgeted cost, on top of what were already very high freight rates that have obviously mitigated now. But so hopefully that gives a little kind of context for what we'll talk about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that helps. And I mean, to be honest, if we talk about the pandemic, yes, we're all a little bit tired of that topic, but it just really surfaced the fragilities within the supply chain and what happens if there's sort of disruptions that clog up a little bit the standard process. And it makes sense that if things move slower than normal, all the fees, all the charges that relate to time spent essentially become a bigger factor. And especially, and that's what we see with many of our customers that we talk to, which are mostly NVOCCs and freight forwarders on the container user side, the less sort of control and visibility you have over your processes, the worse it is, right? That's where oftentimes also technology comes into play in order to help forwarders orchestrate those movements a little better and save costs out of it. Yep. Cool. Okay, having sort of that definition part sort of a little bit out of the way. Chantal, maybe turning to you in the sort of, we've all read a little bit about the FMC, Federal Maritime Commission, being involved and sort of having some decisions in front of them. What's that all about, and what's expected by end of this month?
So obviously they were meant to be making a decision about regulations by the end of the month. Clearly there's only 2 days to go, so I think we can assume, unless a miracle happens tomorrow, that's not going to happen. For us as Drury, it is challenging, I think, for everybody to predict exactly what they might do or what they might not do. But we think they will try to remain neutral, and for the want of a better phrase, to somewhat degree, sit on the fence with this, on the issue, and that their findings and policy document will probably be quite general, because they won't want to be seen to be favouring one side over the other. Obviously, you have in the background the ever-changing US political landscape, which will impact this as well. So I think this is part of the reason why the decision has been delayed. But I think it's a very difficult job to try to regulate something where you don't want to be seen to be favouring one side or the other, but the two sides often conflict on what's a fair cost, what's a fair price, when do I pay, when do I not pay? And it all ties back into this complete lack of visibility on what's happening with the containers. That ranges not just from, the day-to-day operations, but, if you're trying to procure ocean freight, when does the clock start? When does the clock stop? Who's responsible? Who's delaying the cargo? And there's all these sort of different factors aside of the market that come into play, which are practically impossible to regulate because that's how the market and the business works. So I think this is part of the difficulty that they're having to try and put something in place that seems to be fair and neutral.
Makes sense.
Christian, you made a great point, Chantal, about cause. I think when I think about the challenge that the FMC has in establishing whether detention demurrage fees are in a particular instance, the cause issue is really difficult to create policy around, right? If you flash back to the pandemic, you had a lot of big US retail importers who had extravagant amounts of free time built into their contracts, demurrage free time, meaning they could store their containers on US terminals. If another importer that didn't have those favorable terms was unable to retrieve their cargo because terminals were clogged, but they exceeded the number of free days, who is the cause? How do you sort of apportion cause in that instance, in sort of rulemaking or legislation, right? It's incredibly difficult. There's so many permutations we were sort of waiting on for rulemaking to come out this month, and what we've been hearing is end of summer, with kind of the idea that let's not rush things, but actually try to make it as right as possible. But it's sort of in some cases, it's someone is going to be unhappy with this whatever rulemaking is issued. So
exactly, and I suppose the analogy would be it's trying to walk a spider web. You either go round and round, or you hit the spider, and you go round, or you just fall off. So if you think about the FMC trying to navigate the ocean freight spider web, it becomes a practically impossible task to do something that is fair and acceptable to both parties. And I think this is where they're really struggling. And I think, this will rumble on for some time. And then if and when it comes into play, how is it applied? Who applies it, and how stringent are you with it? So then there's the whole sort of, post-regulation and use of those, which I think will be difficult for both parties again.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out, in your analogy, who is the big nasty spider.
Well, that is the ever question. Well, that's the point. If you're the FMC is going to hit a spider either way, it's going to be a BCO or a carrier.
Okay. Well, let's leave it at that. Let's stay neutral. But I mean, it makes sense that it's such a complex topic, especially with so many stakeholders and different sort of opinions and expectations. It's cumbersome, so to speak, and that explains sort of some of the delay in the process. In the end, what puzzles me a little bit is that if you think about sort of demurrage detention, and I don't know, some BCOs having more favorable terms or higher negotiation power and whatnot, in the end, it should be a free market, right? Like what free days you negotiate and what charges you negotiate or are able to negotiate afterwards, what carriers are offering versus their competitors. It should be a free market. But maybe in the end, what should be regulated is something that you mentioned. When does the clock start? Like, what are the timestamps, and ultimately maybe also who has the burden of proof to say, hey, like I could not pick up the container because there was congestion, so I should only start paying once the terminal releases or is actually able to release my container or something like that.
I think the rulemaking is much more around some of the semantics of the process, as opposed to dictating, X importer should only, or all importers should only have X amount of free days and sort of level the playing field. I don't think the FMC is not interested in getting into those kind of contractual, because that's a service level, right? That's a differentiator.
Yeah.
So it's much more, I think, yeah, you're right. It's about the clock starts here. This is when billing starts. So there's transparency from the importer and their drayage representative about when the free time clock starts, right? And the rulemaking is about which party bills which party, and how does that relate to who the contractual parties, the original contractual parties, right? Because you have scenarios right now where the shipping line is contracting with the BCO, but the terminal is invoicing the BCO's drayage provider. Yeah. So you have two parties that are handling an invoice for demurrage fee, neither of which signed a contract related to that container, right? So I think it's much more about streamlining those types of things as opposed to, interfering with something that one shipping line might use as a service advantage over another.
Yeah, and I think it's the mapping of those different scenarios that's causing the issue, because once you open that can of worms on who is paying, who is responsible for that particular fee, then it can snowball, because as you say, there's parties that haven't signed a contract but are operationally obliged to deliver and can operationally create the charge as well. So that becomes quite a difficult conversation, which is, I think it links into whether you decouple or couple detention and demurrage as well. So I think, this sort of concept of visibility and transparency on who's incurring the fee and on which element is the issue where BCOs need to get a handle on it themselves, because they need to allow for a greater control of their own cost as well. So they need to be very clear on the roles of their providers within their service contracts as well.
And you have one of the interesting things to develop over the last decade, even before this became such a kind of problem area, is there's every other technology provider in the global logistics space now has some sort of D&D management feature, right? An alert, red, yellow, green tells you this box is about to hit its end of its contractual free times, right? So there are ways to address what Chantal said in ways that there probably weren't a decade ago. So
that's true. Even then, even though if you might have a system, oftentimes data quality behind that is very, very patchy, not just on the container tracking side, which of course have been the topic of the day over the past couple of years, but also actually in terms of what are the contractual terms, what are the free days, what happens after the free, because it's so fragmented, so different between carriers and terminals, etc. And there's just no common database, which it's a bit crazy if you think about it.
No, absolutely. And each shipper has its own approach. We would always advise to try and decouple the detention and demurrage so that you have visibilities on the fees. But your carriers often bind them together to offer what we're now calling, as you've called it, free time, 3 days. So that automatically reduces the visibility on the various charge elements. So, the shipper really needs to understand when the clock starts, is that at container discharge, and it stops when it's returned empty. But in amongst all of that, if you have it coupled together, it makes the cost control harder because you can't see. It's also harder to dispute. So that's why we say decouple, because if you've coupled it together, it's very hard for you to dispute if you feel that the charge is unfair because you don't know what's incurred it. But ultimately, the burden sits with the shipper because the carrier signed up on a free time agreement, not a separate detention and demurrage. So this all ties back to contracts, it ties back to bid structure, it ties to procurement, it ties to just ask for what you need and add a buffer in 10 or 20% either side so that you can control the cost. Now, obviously the world has changed, congestion has eased, there's plentiful boxes around the world, hopefully in the right place these days. So, detention and demurrage falls off the radar slightly anyway, because it becomes less of an issue, but you still need to monitor it and you still need to know what you're paying for, because ultimately, a cost is a cost.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? So it comes back to the question whether for a carrier, D&D, and now I bundle those, but especially detention, whether that's a cost recovery measure, so to speak, because which is oftentimes the argument by the carrier. Hey, I have sort of cost for my equipment. I need to make sure that equipment utilization is high, the turnaround is fast, etc., etc. Or whether it's actually a revenue generating line item. And during the pandemic, maybe it was a little bit easier to say, hey, it's cost recovery because equipment is scarce. I need to make sure that my fleet is back in Asia as fast as possible, so to speak. But now with sort of freight rates being very, very low, carriers' profitability being very much under pressure, it might actually turn into sort of a revenue discussion again. And I don't know what that changes about the future of demurrage and detention.
So for me, it's an ancillary cost item. So in a world where a surcharge is meant to be cost recovery, whether that be BAF or a detention and demurrage charge after your free time days, that should be cost recovery. There shouldn't be any revenue built into that, but it ties into the transparency on the tariffs. So there's many permutations on that carriers and, let's say, their sister terminal operating companies can build into that. So it makes it even less clear for the shippers. So, again, we often urge our clients, benchmark where you are against the market, even if it's on total free time, which isn't ideal, and then only ask for what you need and get very clear tariff rates on those and understand, so that when it comes to the invoicing, you can check that. But again, it's, it can be very opaque to most people. And, the D&D concept is opaque to many anyway.
I guess just like every freight invoice, so to speak, or every line item on the freight invoice, it can be a bit of a spider web or
back to the spider web again, you see.
Christian, I will say, I've never met a single shipper, whether they're right or wrong, but I've never met a single shipper whose perception is not that it's a revenue driver more than a pure cost recovery. I mean, yes, part of what they pay is to recover some costs, but shippers in good times and bad see this as a revenue driving engine for carriers and terminal, and as Chantal said. So whether that means anything or not, right? It's not whatever they think of the cost, they have to be paid, right? So it's much more sort of like what you can control rather than what you can't. So there are some things that are changing in terms of, at least in North America, especially, the legislation that was passed a year ago, OSHA 22, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, specified that carriers have to bill shippers accurately. And shippers technically do not have to pay a demurrage invoice if it is inaccurate. Now, obviously, that means they have to figure out if it's inaccurate, but legislatively, the onus is actually on the carrier to bill correctly. And also, we've seen, ahead of this rulemaking that we were talking about, we've seen a handful of carriers sort of pre-commit to not billing demurrage on weekends at U.S. terminals. So there are some sort of behavioral changes that we're seeing induced by legislative and pending rulemaking that I don't think would have happened outside of those legislative things happening.
Yeah. Cool. Very, very interesting discussion. I'm a little bit mindful of time and got a few more topics to go through here. As a next step, I would love to sort of invite the live audience for participation. And we'll have a link being posted in the chat, I think, with some instructions. It's a service called Menti. And there's a question being asked about which ports or regions have you recently experienced high demurrage and detention fees in. And I'd love to sort of gauge some of the attendee experience here and see what the public opinion, so to speak, is, get some feedback. For us, of course. We have some of the topics or some of the results also from our report, and I'm going to touch on those in just a second. So let's see how interactive our audience is here. Very fancy, but you see already it's of course America, US, some of the more specific ports here, of course some of the larger ports in general, US or America West Coast showing up quite prominently, maybe also due to the disruptions on the labor side that just recently, so that could also be a driver here. Cool. Okay, cool. So that that was a bit of an experiment. Thanks for that. Yeah. So as we've seen, so U.S. ports mostly West Coast, and of course some of the other larger global ports. I've seen Chennai, I've seen Singapore, etc., etc. For us, as part of our report, and again we'll share that afterwards via email as well. We've actually seen demurrage and detention charges drop by 25% year over year, and they're now roughly 14% lower than in 2020. So the 14% you see in the bottom right-hand corner. So you always see the comparison versus the previous year, the year before that, and the year before that, if available. And that's sort of just in that select group of ports or terminals and the select group of carriers that we investigated in. Quite interestingly, Maersk doesn't publish their rates and tariffs, publish it publicly anymore. So that's why they're actually missing in our analysis. You could also think about the spider and the web again, and think about why they stopped publicly showing their rates. But I'll leave that to the audience to speculate a little bit. We still see, if you go to the next slide, we still see 11 ports that have actually charges that are higher than 2020. Some selection here: Antwerp, Jubilee, Ningbo, etc., etc. So quite varied across the globe. Maybe a question to you, Eric and Chantal. Any views, any perspectives on what might be key drivers behind those two trends in terms of average reduction, but also some ports, some terminals now showing higher rates, so against the trend?
Well, I think obviously we know the world has changed since the report has been done previously. So there's two main factors that impact that. It's operational, and then the commercial demand factors. So obviously operationally, the factors that were driving the excessive D&D, such as port congestion, railhead congestion, availability of containers, poor schedule reliability, containers in the wrong location, have all eased. They've practically disappeared now. But what's really helping is obviously the fall in demand. So there's physically less containers moving this year. Obviously, that's linked to increased inflation, reduced customer spend, cost of living crisis. So the market in some ways has corrected the D&D fees, which is why you see that fall. Obviously, in some of the ports, it hasn't gone down, and that's probably tied to sort of either inflationary factors where their costs haven't dropped, lack of automation, still some congestion due to labour disputes, particularly on US West Coast, which is now hopefully all resolved. So I think, when you layer all of that, it's no surprise that you see these findings for 2023.
Yeah.
I would just add, I think, the container volumes are, look terrible this year compared to 2022, 2021 in general. But they're not this is not 2009. They're not way below where they were in 2019 and going into 2020. I would like to think, going back to the point I made at the start, is people just have a keener focus around, understanding when they're about to run into, outside, when they're about to run out of free time and run into days where they would be assessed these fees. So I think there's just a more strategic focus around avoiding these fees in 23 than there would have been in 2020. Even if container volumes are, you know, in the same ballpark, I believe they're a little bit lower now than 20 even, but it was such a acute problem over the last 2 years. It was something that couldn't be ignored anymore. And it was no longer an annoyance, and it was something that needed to be addressed. And I think that's coming through in this, but Chantal is right. Like, if you're incurring fees right now on the demand that we're seeing and the fluidity of ports, there's obviously some issues, labor actions, rail disruptions in certain areas. But overall, if you're incurring fees right now, it says more about you than it does about the market, as opposed to the last 2 years.
And I would agree that there's definitely been a mindset change around detention and demurrage, and the carriers have driven that actually, because when people were trying to secure capacity, they weren't allowed to ask for anything. So they had to cut down all their free time requests. And I think they've just kept doing it. They've kept that as, okay, I'm not going to push that back up to 28, 32 days. I'm going to keep it at the 14 or 10 days that you said you would do. And I'm going to stick to it because I did it. So I don't need to change that because it's keeping my costs low. So in times where it was hard for shippers, they've learned some best practices, and I think they're carrying on with those.
Chantal, just to add on to that, and I'd love to hear what you're hearing as well, or what you're seeing with your clients, is going back to the point of the importance of decoupling these two things. What we're hearing is in contracts, the demurrage side is often driven by the terminal, and a lot of terminals, especially in the US, are not related to, they're not arms of shipping lines. They're independent. They want fluidity through the terminal. They are not going back to the days of they do not want to go back to the days of 30 days of free time for import customers. What we're hearing is shipping lines are being a lot more flexible on the detention side, which is not an issue right now because there are plenty of boxes. No one is in need of boxes. Sorry, Christian, the way they were 2 years ago. But the need to keep terminals fluid has remained, right? So, I think that will be, that's one way where it's very clear that these two processes should not be just joined together simply because they sound good together, right?
Yeah, so, I absolutely agree with you. And we have quite a few conversations about what is the best practice and educating shippers into, tell us what that free time is, tell us what the split is, and they can't. So why don't you look at decoupling it? Why don't you think about the operational factors that are driving those charges? Equipment availability is not one. I suspect the off-hire business is probably going quite well at the moment. So it is about, and also looking about where you're shipping to. So if you're shipping to those ports which maybe aren't automated, or maybe are still suffering from a little bit of congestion, or maybe have had some volumes transfer because other ports were congested, then you're maybe still going to see a little bit of this. But hopefully, if you manage it correctly, you can help them ease that as well. But I think, again, it comes back down to best in practice procurement, and then also best in practice operations. And you need to get in your business those two teams speaking together.
Yeah. It's very interesting. It was actually sort of one of my questions, sort of like what are determining factors for ports and terminals on the one side and shipping lines on the other side, when they think about demurrage or detention schedules, free time, rates, etc. And you're absolutely right. Those factors are different, right? So it's you have port fluidity or throughput, etc. on the one hand side, really no interest in clogging up the system, clogging up the terminal, taking up valuable space that you're then lacking, and your terminal efficiency overall goes down. And on the shipping line side, hey, it's all about your equipment pool. How urgently do you need the boxes back, or are you actually quite happy if the box is with the shipper or the consignee for a while, because then you don't have to pay storage fees or whatnot on the box. So I think it's a very, very interesting dynamic. And also not just from a BCO or shipper side, I think it should make sense to split it up, but also from a shipping line side, because part of that, they don't really have. It's not their fault that the cost is there, the terminal side cost. So it's really about passing that on to the BCO. That should make the negotiation a little bit easier and clearer, I guess.
Which is why infrastructure in terminals is so key, because the productivity that you need to ensure that you don't move into that sort of congested red zone needs to be quite, relatively high, albeit that there's less boxes moving across the quay right now. So I think this is where certain ports and terminals which haven't invested in infrastructure are still suffering from, let's say the malaise of, purely, an inefficient operation. However, some that may or may not be on the list in the Northwest continent may well just be the fact that their demand hasn't been impacted as much as others. So the costs are still being borne. Antwerp, I think it has done quite well. Hamburg is on your ranking of the most expensive D&D charges, and that's probably tied to the type of cargo that they're handling, whether it be direct, whether it be transshipment, whether it be feeder cargo, and where that cargo is going.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting now we're talking about sort of congestion. We now have a different type of congestion compared to sort of the times of the pandemic. To come back to that topic one more time, and we see that particularly in the depots, right? Because now there's a significant surplus of containers. They haven't really been sort of the defleeting, so to speak, hasn't really happened yet in the extent that the industry would need. And so where are all these excess containers, where do they all end up? In depots, they essentially clog up the space in the depots and make depot operations now also more inefficient or less efficient. So you have the same sort of dynamics that you had in the terminals before. Yeah. Cool. Very good. Again, a little bit sort of looking at the clock. I asked a lot of questions now, and it was a very interesting discussion. I'd love to turn it over to the audience overall, see what questions there are. I'm not sure where I see those. Just putting up the Q&A section here. Let's start with this. So Paul asks, what's the legal status of detention costs when an importer clearly indicates he's ready and wants to take delivery of his cargo and the terminal is not able to deliver? What's the status right now, and what do we expect it going forward, maybe after any FMC ruling?
So, yeah, I'm just to be clear on the question, if I'm understanding it correctly, detention again refers to when the container's already left the terminal. If you're referring to demurrage, that's a great question, and one that I think the FMC will be at least in North America again, will be attempting to clarify in terms of if an importer is ready to pick up a box and they're for whatever reason unable to pick up the box. The terminal is shut, the terminal is refusing the trucker for some reason, the container is in an unavailable area of the terminal, or it's in a stack that's unreachable at the time that the trucker has made an appointment or is there to pick it up. That goes back to the cause issue, right? And so I would imagine the rulemaking will be directed around ensuring that the cause of a fee being incurred is clear to all parties so that it can be attributed to the right party. And so the BCO or the drayage representative is not due to pay that fee if it's determined that they made a reasonable effort to pick up their box before free time expired and they were unable to through no fault of theirs. Now, if they get caught in traffic, the truck breaks down, they never set up an appointment, that's a totally different thing. But yeah, if I'm understanding that question correctly.
I think you did. I hope you did. Chantal, anything to add to that?
No, I think I didn't catch the first part of the question, so I think Eric has answered. I've just had a quick read of it, so I think that's answered it.
Okay, perfect. Next question is from an anonymous attendee saying, with the upcoming peak season, what would be an evident trend in the demurrage detention charges on the important trade lane spots?
I think that depends on whether you think there's going to be a peak season or not. So I would, if I were putting my conservative hat on, I would say that there is insufficient demand to create what we would call a peak season. So therefore that negates the issue of D&D increasing. However, that's not to say that D&D can't go up if people don't have the right processes in place. So, you know, it's not all about, you know, the demand peaks, it's also about the processes and how people are handling that. So that would be my comment.
Yeah, I would say, to echo Chantal, I literally just spoke to an NVO yesterday about asking him for a prediction, a pretty decent sized Trans-Pacific NVO, and he said, and this is what we're hearing just in general, is I wouldn't look for recovery in demand until post Lunar New Year next year, right? And so if you assume that to be the case, then it's really about, is there some operational issue at a key port you use that you need to be mindful of that might create a situation where you would incur demurrage? Or, you know, once the container is out of the terminal, some operational thing in the field that would prevent you from returning it on time, rather than there's this big macroeconomic, you know, return in demand that is going to make D&D go back up again. Because I think with every passing day that looks less likely.
Yeah, agree, and that's also sort of what we see and what we hear from our customers. Sort of very little hope for a real peak season, a real uptick in volumes, prices, and ultimately potentially congestion and charges. Although, of course, you mentioned it also, sort of a big contributing factor to whether or not you have to pay demurrage and detention charges is really on the process side, on the monitoring side. How quickly can you take action? How quickly can you, I don't know, alert your agent or your trucker that something's going wrong and that, I don't know, a container was forgotten on the terminal and accrues charges. So I think that's, and that's true in any sort of market situation.
Yeah, that's normal life. There is always going to be an element of D&D being incurred, but the market-driven factors are probably less impactful at the moment. Yeah,
agree. Cool. Next question, also anonymous. Some container operators are starting to diversify into port and logistics infrastructure. For example, Costco investing in Hamburg had a big discussion and dispute here just recently, and also MSC in Bolloré, so the forwarder. Do you think this could improve the demurrage and detention situation? Any views there?
Well, it depends who you ask, doesn't it? Again, so the integrator approach, obviously, we've got the big one, the big blue integrator that's well, they would say complete these days. Is that going to lower detention and demurrage fees, or are the many layers within that going to create even less transparency on what's happening? So I think it, you know, on one hand, common sense says it should help, but on the other hand, we know how the industry is with technology. It's a little bit behind everybody else, so sometimes it creates its own issue. So I think, you know, integration, diversification, if that's what your business needs, is great. I think if you're a carrier, probably more like MSC, until investing in terminals and inland infrastructure, you're going to have greater control than somebody who's gone down the route of going down the forwarder MBOCC logistics integrator route. So, I mean, if I was going to say which one of them would have the more positive impact, I would say the investment in infrastructure side. And I know I've said that before.
Yeah, although there the question then becomes, will the terminal still behave neutral, or sort of give actually sort of preferential rates, tariffs, etc. to the owner, right?
Well, if you've just divorced and you've been investing in terminal infrastructure to ensure that A, you're the largest shipping line in the world and you've got the port and terminal space and the berthing, then you would assume some efficiencies in there. Now, whether that gets passed on or not is another question.
Yes. Cool. And then, by the way, I think this is a super interesting topic for discussion right now, sort of integrator versus sort of pure play specialist. So maybe we'll run a webinar on that too, because I think there's a lot of sort of angles to look at in that discussion as well. Cool. Then we have the next question from Eric, also actually focusing on sort of inland terminals, dry ports. Do you see a role for inland terminals / dry ports in keeping D&D fees to a minimum? Not 100% sure if I understand the question, but
well, I if I'm understanding it, it's if you take a view that these inland depots or connected terminals, connected inland facilities to a seaport help evacuate, containers into a place where they're not tying up the critical sort of shoreside real estate, then can you get more creative in terms of what the tariff is or the contracted free time is in those inland ports, right? Because they're not then clogging up the system in the same way that they would be if they were literally, on dock. So I think the short answer is yes. I mean, one example in the US is Georgia Port Authority established a couple inland ports where they were literally shuttling containers to those inland ports away from Savannah, Savannah was on that list that you just posted a few minutes ago as one of the most expensive places. They saw this huge influx of cargo in 21 and 22. Not to say they weren't ready for it, but it was more than they had ever seen before, partly because of problems on the West Coast, partly just because of huge demand across the US. But that was a response to, a lack of fluidity and the fees that were resulting. And that's it's a unique port authority set up in North America, but that is a very shipper friendly port authority. So they are thinking, how do we cater not just to the shipping lines that call our port, but how do we cater to the shippers that are bringing volume into our port and stoking economic activity inland, right? So they are thinking creatively about how to minimize those types of fees for shippers. So yes, easier said than done, but yeah, absolutely. There's a huge role for those facilities. I mean, you're seeing them used really well in the US East Coast in various ports. Port of Virginia is another one with an inland port that's super effective.
Gotcha. Very interesting. And I think, overall, you always have to put this into context of the overall infrastructure, right? How well is your terminal connected also to hinterland infrastructure, intermodal infrastructure, depots, etc. But okay, very, very interesting having looked at this from that side. Cool. Then there's another question from Jimmy. Said who will actually invest in efficient port operations? So who has to gain the most, or who benefits the most? We already touched upon sort of shipping lines, integrating vertically across the value chain, and then as such also sort of investing into port and terminal infrastructure. Anybody else? Anything else that comes to mind to mention here?
So in my previous life, looking at ports, M&A and due diligence, there's many different people who invest in ports and terminals, and they invest in it because they're long-term revenue generating nodes, because you have to take the concept that goods will move in and out of island locations, UK being a perfect example of that. And that's the way we get all of our consumer products, et cetera, coming in. So you have many different groups who want to invest in the ports for the long term, or the terminals for the long term revenue returns, but to remain competitive, you have to invest in the infrastructure. So then it comes down to, what do you invest in? How do you invest in? Do you focus on automation, semi-automation? Do you then, down the road, they're going to have to look at, their sustainability and their footprint. So there's lots of different parties that are behind the scenes that you don't see that push these things. So it's an interesting market. It's definitely one to watch, and obviously it impacts, the type of vessels that can be handled. When you have the new builds coming in, the different fuel types, they're all going to have to invest to be able to accommodate all of those, aside from just draft. So it's a very important part of the supply chain that often gets forgotten.
Gotcha. Yeah, very, very interesting. And talking about sort of efficiency of ports and terminal infrastructure, Karen asks, what is making the ports so slow, especially in the USA? Is it the process of operations? Yeah, what are contributing factors there that decrease efficiency, especially in the US?
I'm usually based in the US. I'm not sitting in the US right now, so I feel a little safer tackling this question. Tomatoes, they have to throw the tomatoes from farther away. You know, I will answer this question by saying JOC is part of S&P Global. S&P Global partners with the World Bank on a index that rates the efficiency of individual ports. And the last 2 years, the first 2 years that they've released this index, US ports have performed really badly. So, you know, objectively, it's not just demurrage costs. Demurrage costs is sort of a symptom of the inefficiency of US ports. Why is that? I mean, there are a bunch of factors. We have a lot of cargo demand to deal with. I don't want it to be completely consumed with whether terminals are automated or not. But Europe, obviously, Northern Europe obviously has a lot of cargo volume as well. So that's, and obviously ports in China have a lot of volume moving through them. So it's not just that, but it's partly that. These are not, you know, insignificant ports, right? They're huge ports for the biggest economy in the world. You know, it's hard to ignore the fact that there are very strong labor unions that are fairly, what's the right word?
Active?
Active, no, I was gonna say they're successful. They are successful in terms of maintaining a certain set of processes that are conducive to their, you know, union, which is what unions do, right? So I'm trying to be as diplomatic about this as possible, but the reality is, on the whole, ports are not as efficient because they just are not set up to be those conduits of movement through the terminals. That's not, and that's generalizing, right? There's terminals that have that focus, that innate focus. There's terminals that have a better balance of imports and exports, right? Most US terminals are much more import focused. So that creates this real heavy one-way traffic and a little bit of a different volume of flow on the export side. So it's really hard to drill it down to one aspect. But you know, we can talk about the lack of automation in US ports.
But it's also the inland constraints as well. It's not all down to the ports.
Yeah,
so I think, in fairness, you know, in other areas where they have better connected intermodal transport solutions, it makes the ports more efficient. If you're just trying to get everything out on the road, that in itself is an inefficient thing. So, you know, the port could be working with high levels of productivity, but if the cargo physically can't get out quick enough because there's not enough trailers there or truck drivers or whatever it is, then that impacts the operation. So, you know, it's not fair to say it's all down to the port or the terminal, it's how it's connected as well.
Right. Some of the congestion in LA and Long Beach, which are very well connected by intermodal rail, was down to backups in Chicago at the other end of the rail, you know, kind of leg on those import moves, backing all the way up to rail service in Southern California, right? To the point where one of the railroads actually stopped intermodal service between Southern California and Chicago for a couple of weeks, right? So you're right, Chantal, it's a system, right? It's not just the nodes. And they don't work well together. We don't have we've never really had a national freight policy in the US, despite how important freight is to our economy. Partly it's because people who work in this industry did such a good job, they obscured how hard it is to do what they do. And some of that became a little more apparent during the pandemic, but there's not a real kind of like systematic approach to making sure that container terminals are as unencumbered as possible.
Yeah. Maybe one last topic maybe that you didn't touch upon so much was competition, right? So if there's significant competition between ports and terminals for cargo flow, one of the arguments is for bringing cargo one way or bringing bookings one way is efficiency. We're more efficient, we're faster, we're cheaper. So route your shipments through us. Maybe that's not so pronounced in the US.
It's getting that way though. The Gulf Coast, East Coast have been luring. I mean, our data is pretty clear on this. They've been luring cargo for a very long time, and that went into hyperdrive over the last few years. So
yeah, and if you see the share of import cargo flowing into the US, we now have a higher share of Gulf and East Coast ports than on the West Coast. So it's certainly some competition.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool, perfect. I think we've gone through most of the questions, if not all. If we forgot any, then we'll definitely collect some answers afterwards and share them as part of our follow-up when we share the report and the recording. So if you asked a question and didn't get an answer, we'll make sure to get you one at least tomorrow. Having said that, thanks a lot for joining. Enjoy the report. If there are any questions, comments, thoughts, etc., feel free to always reach out or, of course, comment on one of our posts on LinkedIn. Happy to continue the discussion there. And last but not least, of course, I want to quickly highlight that we'll have our upcoming Digital Container Summit in Hamburg in September. So 13th to 14th of September. DCS, it's the second time that we do it in person after the pandemic again. So really looking forward to some interesting discussions, some interesting presentations, and of course, lots of networking. Find all the information also on our website. So make sure to check it out. That's it from us. Very much on time, I think. Thanks a lot, Eric. Thanks a lot, Chantal, for joining and contributing your views, experience, expertise. I think this was a very, very interesting discussion. Very much looking forward to next time, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you.